Welcome back to HPS Insights. I'm your regular host, Brian DeAngelis, a partner here at Hamilton Place Strategies. And today I have a fun episode for all of our listeners out there. We are going to turn over the podcast to several of our associates here at the firm, a few of which work behind the scenes every week to produce our podcasts here. But we've given them the opportunity to come together and talk about what it is to be an associate here at Hamilton Place Strategies, what it's like to work here, what it's been like to work through the COVID-19 pandemic, deal with the work from home challenges after being recent graduates and starting their career. And we're looking forward to a pretty insightful conversation from our own Jack and Will and Matisse. So I hope you all enjoy this episode, and I will hand it over to Jack.
From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights Podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your guest host today, Jack Eichner, an associate at HPS. Today I'll be talking to two of my fellow associates and friends, Matisse Rogers and Will Newell, about working in your first job, Gen Z and remote work, and more. Matisse, Will, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. Excited to be here today. I'm Matisse. I've been an associate here at HPS for almost 3 years. I started in the fall of 2019. Went to the University of Michigan for undergrad, Go Blue, where I studied public policy. And during my time at HPS, I have focused on kind of economic development and ESG clients. Most recently, I've been seconded to one of our clients to do kind of more of a deep dive into ESG reporting and communications.
All right, and my name's Will. Happy to be here as well, Jack. Thanks for having us. I'm an associate as well. I've been here just about 2 years, started in the fall of 2020, went to Vanderbilt University where I studied public policy and economics. My clients have been mainly in the nonprofit sector, some technology clients as well lately.
Awesome, and Will, I love Vanderbilt, but Matisse, as you know, I'm also a Michigan grad, so I'm glad to have this podcast dominated by Wolverines. And I'm also, as I said, an associate, and I've been here for just a little bit over a year working on issues in ESG tech, as well as some fintech issues as well. And so to jump into it a little bit, I wanted to sort of set the scene here. And Matisse, last year you were on a series that HPS did on getting a job in DC, and for those of you that haven't listened to that podcast, it was really a great podcast that for someone who was a summer intern or a senior in college looking for their first job, hearing from people who have been through that experience and now successfully landed their first job about how they did that was, for me, very impactful as I was getting ready to start at HPS. And I know that my friends who were looking for jobs found that podcast really impactful when I shared it with them. And so what we want to talk about today is sort of a sequel to that and sort of thinking about, okay, you've landed your first job in DC. What's the first 6 months like? How do you make such a huge transition in your life from being in college where schedules are a little wacky, sleep schedules are funky, studying for tests to, writing memos and things like that. It's a big change. And I want to start, with you, Will. What are your first 6 months in your job like, and what's so important about that time from a learning and growth perspective?
Yeah, it's a very good foundational question to start with, I think. So those first 6 months, if I recall correctly, were all about taking in as much as you possibly could with as open mind as you could possibly have. I think there's a big difference between paying to learn in school versus being paid to work. The expectations are higher. You are accountable to more people, not just yourself. And you need to kind of get used to this whole new way of working, this whole new way of answering to more people and to being accountable to your teams in a very new way. I think you're sort of on rails for those first 6 months. You have a lot of people investing in your growth and development. It's important to take that with an open mind, to be sort of flexible in your thinking. And I think actually to memorialize a lot of the things you learn, write down good practices, form good habits early, and they'll pay dividends for years to come.
And I one of those things you said about memorializing the things we learn, I can't tell you how many people when I started first told me, take feedback and then write it down and come back to it a week later and look at that feedback and make sure that you're internalizing it. And once you write it down and you look it over, it really does. It's something so small that makes a big difference. Yeah. So, Matisse, you were on last year's podcast with a partner at HPS, Matt McDonald, where we talked about getting a job in DC. And during that interview, Matt talked a lot about during your first 6 months being on the steep part of the learning curve. And I want to hear a little bit more about you, 3 years in. What does that mean to be on the steep part of the learning curve? And what does it mean when you sort of reach the peak of that and it sort of starts to flatten a little bit? How do you know, during that first 6 months that you're, tracking your own progress and doing well? And what does it mean to be, doing well on that learning curve? How do you know if you're falling behind? So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think I probably have the blurriest memory of my first 6 months of anyone here, but thinking back on it, it really felt to me like a bit of drinking from the fire hose, and that's not to say that in a negative way, but it really is a period in time in which you are focusing on intake of information rather than kind of implementing what you're learning in practice in ways where you really see it pay dividends. So to Will's point, I think it is really about focusing on, not memorizing everything you're learning, not trying to perfect everything right away, but really knowing where to look when you are in those kind of real world client settings so you can reference back to the information that you learned at first. And I know especially HPS puts a huge emphasis on training in those first 2 weeks. And when I think back to that period of time, I was unwell. I was like very overwhelmed. You're coming from being kind of the big dog on campus and you feel like you've kind of done college successfully, you know your way around, you're really comfortable with what you're doing at school, and then you are here at HPS, all of a sudden you are kind of in a new setting, you are with new people, more than likely you're in a new city. So I think getting through those first 6 months is really not about trying to perfect what you're doing, but it's more about just kind of being open to this intake of new information, acknowledging that there are things you might not know, being humble. And to your point, Jack, on how you determine whether or not you're successful in those first 6 months, I think HPS does a great job of kind of setting up more formal ways to measure how you're doing. So check-ins with your directors, mentorship conversations with associates who are more tenured than you, but then also kind of that official 6-month review that HPS has in place. But then in addition to that, I think HPS does a great job of giving new associates really hands-on opportunities to dive into the work right away and get that feedback from directors on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis.
Yeah, and to your point there, I think something so important to take away from that is during that first 6 months, you're constantly what I would describe as uncomfortable in a new situation. And I think that during that first 6 months, it's really about learning to become comfortable.
Yep.
Both comfortable in your job, but also comfortable with being uncomfortable. And because you're exposed to so many new and different things that you're not going to know everything all at once. And I think back to, a conversation I was having with a friend, and we were talking about, do we think we're good associates? Like, do we think we know what's going on? And we both, yeah, we think we're fine. Yeah. And one of my friends' response to me, he goes, yeah, you seem like you're pretty comfortable. And I go, okay, that might be a great dodge to the question that I asked, but I'll take that as a compliment because I do think it means, once you've started to get comfortable, you've learned the ropes of what's required of you and what's expected of you, and you're sort of ready to take the punches as they come because, as all of us know, there's always going to be new things, new challenges coming in on a daily basis. And that's part of what makes, I think, the job and HPS a really good place to start your career, that you're always going to be challenged and with new topics, new deliverables and things like that. And Will, just to close out this section, you're now 2 years in, and Matisse, you're 3 years in. What's something that, after that first 6 months going into, year 1, year 2, and beyond, that you see is really important for growth beyond those first 6 months and year?
Yeah, so I think we talked about that learning curve in those first 6 months. That learning curve starts to flatten a bit. The longer you are tenured at HPS or any company, the more fundamental skills you're going to have down pat. The training wheels are going to come off. So the expectations start to increase a little bit. Your skills will increase, but so does the burden upon you to, or I shouldn't say the burden, the onus on you to contribute strategically, to be a thought partner to your supervisors, to push back where you see opportunities to do so. I mean, you should be doing those things in your first 6 months as well, but they really become the highest priority, or rather a competing priority with just getting the very basics down once you get past those early months. And I think that is it's a challenging thing to do, because it's an act of reclaiming some of that leadership, some of that independent thinking that maybe you're used to in college, and you get to kind of look back on some of those old skills you have from maybe running meetings in student organizations or figuring out how to use your voice in a group. You kind of get to reach back and use some of those skills and combine them with what you've learned about your workplace to be the best contributor that you possibly can early on. I think your supervisors start to trust you more as you're more tenured, and that gives you a lot of room to be a fully contributing part of the team. I think you are already in those early months, but again, that expectation just goes up a little bit the longer you are in your position.
And I think a nice thing about how steep the learning curve is at HPS is that when you are past that first 6 months or that first year, you have a wealth of knowledge that you can now kind of bestow upon newer associates, interns. I think the opportunity for mentorship comes a lot sooner than it might come at other organizations, where it takes longer to get fully up to speed. Training maybe isn't as formal in your first few weeks. So I think, to Will's point, you find yourself in that position of leadership a lot quicker than you think you might. I know I felt that way. Will, I know we've had conversations about that. You become the senior associate on your team, or the more tenured associate on your team, oftentimes in only a matter of months at HPS.
Yeah, and I've noticed that myself with sort of my transition into my second year as well, starting to take more of a tenured approach to being an associate on a team, and I think that's really it's a great learning experience for me, and sort of highlights the continual areas for growth that HPS and working at HPS offers you. But I want to take a quick break before we come back, and we'll talk a little bit more about how our first 6 months and experiences at HPS differed and were similar as it relates to remote and hybrid work because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get back to it.
HPS is looking for full-time public affairs associates and analysts. We're seeking entry-level associates and analysts to join our dynamic team. Associates have immediate client exposure and opportunities for professional development while working in a fun, fast-paced, and challenging environment. Our application will open later this month. Recent graduates or applicants with up to 3 years of postgraduate work experience are encouraged to apply. Learn more and stay up to date on our openings at hamiltonplacestrategies.com/careers.
Welcome back to HPS Insights. I'm your host today, Jack Eichner, and I'm here with Will and Matisse, and we've been talking about young people in the workplace and our first jobs coming out of college. And to dive back into it a little bit, we were talking about how our experiences were similar and different, and what it's like to learn and grow during your first 6 months at HPS. And I want to talk a little bit now about how we've all managed remote and hybrid work. We know this is such a hot button topic among Gen Zers, but also, other older generations as well. And I know that we've all seen the remote work TikToks, and it's safe to say, I think, that the conventional wisdom is that young people like remote work. They don't always view the office as necessary, but I do want to talk about how I think I came across a a poll a few weeks ago in a really interesting Fortune article, and one might even call it a hot take based on all the remote work TikToks we see, and the article is about how Gen Z actually doesn't want to work from home, which I was pleasantly surprised to see, because it sort of aligns with a lot of how I feel. And it, one of the stats was less than a quarter of Gen Zers, feel remote work is very or extremely important to them, and only 13% of respondents said they favor remote training and onboarding, whereas 63% said they'd rather do it in person. And I have a lot to say here, as I often do, but because I do think the perspective of young workers who do want to be in the office and who value working in the office isn't always highlighted, and I don't think we always get sort of the nuance of the importance of being in the office. But before I dive in, Matisse, Will, what are your thoughts on this? Especially, both of you had somewhat different experiences during your first 6 months, starting pre-pandemic and then starting in the middle of the pandemic. Will, so Matisse, talk to us a little bit about that.
So I am the first person to go to bat for work from home. I love the flexibility. I love being able to have a load of laundry in while you're kind of ticking through your checklist. But I do think the first 6 months where I was in the office before COVID hit were essential to my growth at the firm and kind of my comfort at the firm. So I started September 2019. The 6-month mark was actually right around March 2020, where we went remote and stayed remote for over a year. And I think having those friendships and having developed those kind of personal relationships with folks at the firm, both my peers and kind of people in management and partners at HPS, was essential to, getting up that steep part of the learning curve, but then continuing to learn in a remote setting and feeling like I had somewhat of a grasp on what was happening. And, I do think that remote work is, to your point, Jack, a huge part of the conversation today, because now it becomes kind of more of a retention issue. But, at the time, in those first 6 months, remote work was not an option whatsoever at HPS. I never saw myself working from my one-bedroom apartment in D.C., but those were kind of, that was the reality of the times that we dealt with, and we got through it. But I do think having that foundation in place from in-person work is something that is incredibly valuable when, to our earlier point, you're new to the city, you're new to the working world, and you really are in this mode of intake of information.
So I had a very different experience in my early times here, because, like Jack mentioned, I started right in the middle of the pandemic, before vaccines, in September 2020. Still so much uncertainty about how long we would be working remotely then, about what the future looked like. And I can recall finding it really difficult to form strong relationships early on like that. It became much more a matter of intentionally taking ownership of your outreach to others, of actually putting time on people's calendars to have a virtual coffee, to ask them for feedback explicitly. Because I think when you're in the office, I've learned from making that transition, you get feedback, you form relationships, you have productive conversations just off the cuff. The sheer quantity of time that you spend interacting with your peers and your supervisors is so much greater when you're in the office, which I don't think is all that obvious for people like me who started remotely. I didn't really know what the implications were of working remotely. And I will say that I think because I started, without any in-person experience, all I knew was remote work for a while. And warming up to the in-person office experience took a little longer, probably, than it did for most of my peers who were a bit older. I think that the big takeaway for me is that once you get past that initial discomfort, once you get used to, admittedly getting up a little earlier, paying a bit for the metro, it's worth it, because you're just spending so much more quality time with your supervisors, with your peers, learning more, and doing the things you should be doing in the early days of your career, building relationships, forming skills, making good habits. All of those things should be among your top priorities early on. And I do think it differs between our situation and those of the people who are more tenured than us. I think you kind of have an inverted bell curve situation where young workers benefit a lot from working from working in person. Senior management certainly wants their workers back in the office. I think people in their 30s, 40s, more established professionals who have childcare to take care of, who have families to attend to, their concerns are a little bit different. They've built some of those foundational skills and relationships, but nonetheless, we want them to be in the office to learn from them. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword there. But overall, I'm glad we made the transition, and I would say I've fully adapted to it, and I think you will too if you're listening to this and you're worried about starting remotely and then going in person or vice versa or whatever it may be.
Yeah, and just to build off that, Will, I think I agree with all of those points, and HPS is very good about saying, like, if you have a family consideration, something to attend to, an appointment, whatever. We're very flexible in that format, but I do like the in-person format, and to me it's really it's about happiness. I think that when I'm in the office, I'm much, and apologies for getting a little bit meta here, but when I'm in the office, I'm a little bit happier than I am just working in my apartment, and that comes down to a few things. It comes down to being able to turn around from my desk and talk to my friend who's sitting 10 feet away and about this message we just got or something like that, or being able to get direct feedback very quickly from a director and being able to get nuance out of that feedback that you're not going to get in an email with that feedback. So that to me is such an important thing. And being able to have those conversations where you get that feedback, I think it fosters sort of some deeper critical thinking that is so essential to doing the job and to really growing in your first job. I think being able to think critically about the problems you're working on is something that took me a little bit to adjust to and to be able to do well. And I'm sure I'm still, maybe in 6 months I'll look back and go, wow, I really wasn't. But, I think that, it's all about continual growth. And I just think that being in the office is something so important to that. I think, it sort of ties into the next topic I wanted to sort of touch on here, which is, making the most out of your first job and being young in DC I think a lot about this New York Times article, which I'm sure many of you have seen recently, which is about sort of making your, the magic of your first work friends. And it's really true that what the article talks about is how, important those relationships are that you build in your 20s and how they last into your 30s and 40s and beyond, and how sort of the article talks about how those relationships sort of make, a foundational and monumental impact on the way your life, the course of your life, both personally and professionally. And I think for me, it's been so important to make those friends that I've made. And I think it's made my time in DC so much more enhanced by just being able to make those relationships and friendships. But I want to kick it back to Matisse and Will now. What being in DC, it's your first job. How do you make the most of it? How do you DC is such a great place to be. How do you take your first job and both professionally and personally and sort of make the most out of it while you're here?
Yeah, I saw that article too, Jack, and it actually was circulated in the group chat of September 2019 Stars, which just goes to show how close you remain with people you meet at HPS. But I really think that the value of in-person work and the value of working in DC for your first job really extends beyond the office, into things like happy hours with your coworkers, into things like kind of having that insular group of friends that you can go out with on the weekend, you can visit museums with. And I think HPS is so special because it is such it's a firm that is very heavy with recent grads and younger people who are all kind of in a similar boat. We're all new to the city. A lot of us don't have roots here, don't have family here. So it's really just about kind of going out on a limb and not only grabbing lunch with people at HPS, but seeing who wants to grab dinner after work and just kind of putting yourself out there in a way that is kind of unfamiliar to you as a college senior who may have kind of that set group of friends and set network on campus, but is something that you're going to kind of need to push yourself to do when you're in a new city. And I think DC is the best city for new graduates. Maybe a controversial take, but I stand by it. It is not overwhelming, but you still have that big city feeling. The food scene is amazing. The museum scene is amazing, and museums are free. So I really think being a young person in DC is really such a fun experience, and like the world is really your oyster when you get here.
Totally, and I can confirm that the food here is very good, and I think I could do a whole other podcast about just eating in DC, and I think in fact
absolutely good.
Our partner at HPS, Tony Fratto, has a new podcast out about food specifically, so I think we might have to go look and give a listen to that one as well. But Will, I know we have a couple minutes left here. You know, as we said, you're sort of transitioning into your third year, and how are you thinking about the year ahead? You know, professionally, personally, and looking back at when you started. What's something that you're, you know, where are you going to push yourself over the next year?
Yeah, that's the big question for sure. I think it all comes down to taking ownership of your own development, of recognizing that while everyone absolutely will help you here, it's important to also put in that work yourself, to look for subtleties in your development, look for, you know, nuanced ways to improve, because they're not going to be as obvious as, you know, the basic things that you might expect early on in your tenure, like, you know, getting your work done on time, punctuality, you know, the basic skills. Those should be in the back at this point. Now you should really be thinking about how to round yourself out as a professional, how to get exposure to new issues and new skill sets, and prepare yourself for whatever is going to come next. And on that note, I think it's important to have a lot of conversations, not just with your supervisors, but also, you know, as we've alluded to here, your peers. It's so valuable to make those good relationships with your fellow associates, and know, you know, what's on their mind, what are they thinking, where are they going, because you can learn a lot about your plans and how you want to develop from them and what they're experiencing. There's just so much knowledge all around you when you work at a big place like this. I shouldn't say big, but when you work at a place with a lot of talented young people around you like this, there's a lot to learn. Take advantage of it and take the initiative to find out more.
Yeah, and I cannot agree more with the sentiment of learning from your peers. I think that, you know, during my first year, obviously I was the junior associate on many teams, and I can't tell you how many times I had a conversation with the more senior associate or just an off-the-cuff conversation where I think I learned so much about how to do this deliverable, how to, you know, how to frame something for review to a director, or how to, you know, address a nuance with a certain client or something like that. And so I totally agree, you know, sort of finding those people of HPS and taking that knowledge and taking everything in is so important. And, you know, Matisse, you're sort of in your third year, and you've been here the most tenured out of all of us. And, you know, I'll let the audience know here that you're going to Harvard Law School next year, just a university named Harvard. Never heard of it. How has HPS helped you, you know, helped prepare you to take this next step, and what wisdom can you sort of leave us and the listeners here with as we close out?
Sure. So I think practically HPS is an amazing place to start your career, whether law school's on your radar, whether kind of moving up the chain at HPS is something you'd be interested in, whether you're interested in an MBA, for a couple different reasons. I think, you know, having exposure to client services so early on in a way where associates are actually interacting with clients, you know, owning items on client calls, sending deliverables over to clients directly, that's something that's really invaluable, and is something that is really going to be applicable across different industries. And then, you know, I think the fact that you have the chance to work on so many different issue areas at HPS is something that is incredibly valuable too. So, you know, I've focused on ESG and economic development, but I've also worked on transportation and trade and tech. And that has been really insightful in kind of finding out what I want to focus on when I am at law school in the fall. And I think kind of from a more personal standpoint, HPS is just a great place to kind of find that initial support and foundation in your career. So everyone has been incredibly supportive of my law school application journey. I think HPS is a really special place because it's not a secret if you are kind of considering other opportunities, if school is on your radar. I know a lot of friends from undergrad who have kind of had to keep those plans under wraps at their initial jobs, and that is not at all the case at HPS. So really just having that, network of friends, but also support from management is something that has been incredibly useful. And I think the word of wisdom I would leave is just to really advocate for yourself while you're at HPS and wherever you are in your first job. I think there are more opportunities available to you than you might think. The skills you're learning are more applicable to your next step than you might think, and a lot of it has to do with really just asking for new opportunities instead of waiting for them to come to you, and that is something that HPS makes it incredibly easy to do.
Yeah, and I can't tell you, you're not the first person to give me that piece of advice, but I will say that having heard it, enough times, I think it's been, driven into my brain that's like the single most important thing is advocate for yourself, advocate for what you want to do, what you want to work on, and things like that. And so, we really appreciate you, and we will definitely miss you, but know you're going on to great things at Harvard.
Thank you.
And, so I think we'll leave it there, and I just want to say thanks again for tuning in to another episode of HPS Insights. Again, huge thank you to Will and Matisse for joining me today, along with the entire content strategy team at Hamilton Place Strategies for letting us associates hijack today's episode of HPS Insights. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies' work and our podcasts at www.hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insights. I'm your host, Jack Eichner, and as always, thanks for listening to HPS Insights.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.